what we're going to do today is we're going to take a look at this snippet that was sent to me. Somebody on the forum is having a problem with this bit of code, and they made a little snippet here for me to have a look at, and we're going to look through it. So I haven't investigated it properly yet, so I don't know what's here, so we're exploring this together. So we've got a bunch of sine wave generators, just got an envelope in each one by the look of it. And what I know is the problem that they're having is getting a grip on arrays, and that's what we're really going to be looking at today. So I can see we're grabbing each sine wave generator into a separate variable. We're grabbing two panels, these two, into separate variables. And then we've got an array called array, which is taking the first and second sine wave generator. We've got another array called array2, which is taking the two panels. And we've got another array called array3, which is taking the third and fourth sine wave generator. And then we've got an array called joined, which contains array2 and array3. Okay, and then we've got a button, and this is the callback for the button, and let's just indent that properly so it's easier to read. What they're attempting to do is go through this joined array and set the bypass to the inverted value of the button. So when the button's off, it gives a 1, and when the button's on, it gives a 0. And then array 2, which is our panels, they're wanting to show it based on the button's value. So that is kind of making sense. And we've got some errors, which we're going to ignore for now. So I think this part will work actually just with the panels because that looks okay. So I'm just going to comment that out. And if I hit F5, let's see. So that will probably just work. Yeah. So that bit of the code is actually fine. But the problem here is a misunderstanding of how arrays work. I can see what's going on here. So they're trying to set joined.setBypassed, and it's saying down here, set bypassed, where are we? Unknown function set bypassed. Whenever you see that unknown function, it means that the thing on the left-hand side of the dot doesn't have a function called set bypassed. And if you want to see all the things that do have a function called set bypassed, you can just type set bypassed into the API browser, and you'll see a list of all the available places where you can have set bypassed. So why doesn't it have set bypassed? Well, they're obviously thinking it's got array 2 and array 3 in it, and array 2 has panels and array 3 has sine wave generators. So they're thinking that, okay, well, sine wave generators do have a set bypassed function, which is true. So the problem here is that joined contains an array. So joined I is referring to an array, and arrays don't have a set, you can't bypass an array, it doesn't have a set bypass function. I can see what they were thinking. They were thinking that since joined contains an array that contains a sine wave generator and contains a panel, therefore set bypass should be applied to all of the panels or all of the sine wave generators, but it doesn't work like that. You're applying it to this thing. So let's just take a moment and let me think how to do this. Okay, we'll just write down here. So I will comment all of this out for now. And we're just going to go back to basics here, and we're going to take a look at arrays and variables. So your normal variable, call it V, you can think of it as like a little box of computer memory where you can put a value. So we could put the value 10, for example. It doesn't have to be a number, it could be a string, it could be a reference to a module, it could be just a character, but we'll just put a number in there for now. But that's your little box of memory, that's what a variable is. Now, when it comes to an array, that's the same as a variable, except it gives us several boxes of memory. So instead of having one box of memory, like we do for a variable, we can specify a specific number of boxes of memory to have. So if I do this, for example, we've now got an array with one box of memory, and that box of memory contains the value 10. And when we're talking about arrays, these boxes of memory are called elements. And you'll see that this is the same as a variable. We've got one element, one box of memory, and it contains a value 10. The only difference is how we refer to it. So if we were to output the variable, we'd do console.print v, and that would output 10. If we wanted to do the same for our array, we'd put A, and then in the square brackets we have to specify which element. Well, we only have one element, 0, and again it outputs 10. So in this instance, element 0 of our array is essentially the same as our variable. It's one little box of memory where we can store a single value. Now, if we wanted to expand on this and just use variables, we could have v1 equals 20, v2 equals 30, and v3 equals 40. And now we've got 4 boxes of memory where we're storing 4 different values. And if we want to access those, we can just refer to them here. V is obviously going to be 10, v1 20, v2 30, and so on. So that's how we can store 4 different values using variables. But we can do the same thing with arrays, and we only need one array to do it. So we could have an array called A, as we do, and then to specify extra values, you just use a comma. So now we've got 4 values stored in our array. So it's the same as we've got here. I'll call it v0 just to be clear. So our array 0 is going to be 10, and our array 1 will be 20, 2 will be 30, and so on. So it's just exactly the same as we had with the variables. It's just that we're doing it with a single named bit of memory. So this piece of memory, we've called it A. That's the name of our array. And it's given us the number of boxes we need to store our values in. And we've assigned 4 values. So that means we get 4 boxes. So the real advantage of using arrays is, first of all, it allows us to write less lines of code. You can see we've written 1 line of code to do the same job as 4. And it also allows us to access values in a loop really easily, which again reduces the number of lines of code we've got to write. And that increases maintainability of code and makes your code easier to read. So let's do some stuff with loops. In a standard for loop, we'd write for I, and that doesn't have to be I, it could be J or K or whatever letter you like, but the standard one is I. For I equals 0, and 0 refers to where we're going to start counting from, and our first element of our array has always got an index of 0. But we could start counting from 1 and then would skip off that first element. So I equals 0, I is less than, and this is where we put how many values we want to count through. So in our array we have 4 values, and they start at 0, so the 4th value has an index of 3. So we put I is less than 4, and that would count between 0 and 4. So it goes 0, 1, 2, 3. But because we're using an array, we don't have to hard code this number here, because if we had another value, let's say we had another value to our array, we'd then have to update this to be 5, and if we had another value to our array, we'd have to update this to be 6, and that can be a bit cumbersome, especially in a big project. But what we can do is we can actually just grab certain properties from arrays, so we can just check what the length of the array is, which it tells us how many elements it's got basically. And we do that by writing the name of the array, putting a dot, and then typing length. And that will say how many elements are in this array. And then we put I++. Now plus is an increment operator. So it's the same, for example, as writing I equals I plus 1. So this is just an automatic thing in hise script, and it comes from JavaScript, and it's the same in other languages such as C++. But it's just increasing I by 1 every time we go through the loop. If you want to count backwards through a loop, you can put I minus minus, and that will mean each time you go through the loop, reduce I by 1. Then we'll put curly braces, and now we can output the value of our array to the console. So we can do console.print A, and then before, where we were typing in an element like 0 or 1 or 2, we can just put I in there, because I is going to have the value of 0, 1, 2 all the way up to the length of the array. So if I hit F5, this will print out all of the values of our array. Now this is the advantage of arrays, because we couldn't do this with our individual variables. the only way to print out all of the individual variables is to write separate console.print commands. So do v0, v1, v2, and v3, and I'll just comment out our loop. And I'll hit F5 on this, and you can see it does the same thing. So our loop with our array is saving us lots of lines of code. So this would be the version with the variables from here to here. And this is the version with the array. So you can see it really simplifies your code and reduces the number of lines of code you've written. And it also makes it much more extendable, because if we want to add another 3 values to this, there's 3 values done, and it will print them all out. If I want to do the same thing with the variables, I have to do it like this. I have to rename each one, then set the values, and then print them out, and then change them. And now it'll do the same thing. So you can see it's a lot more work, a lot more lines of code, and it's a lot less simple to work with than it is when you're dealing with an array. But an array, you can just think of each array element as being a variable, because that's essentially what it is. Okay, so that's the sort of overview of variables and arrays and loops. I'll show you one more thing you can do with arrays. If you don't need the I value, if you're not doing any calculations inside your loop, then you probably don't actually need the value of I, so you can use a different type of loop. So we'll comment this one out. You can use what's called the for in loop. So for, and then you need a variable name. It's usually sort of a convention to use X, but use something else if you're already using X for another loop. And then you write in, and then the name of your array, and then console.print X. And oh, we're still printing out all this stuff as well. Let me just comment that out. There we go. So the for in loop, what it's doing is, rather than giving us a counter that's saying 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, rather than doing that, it's just giving us the direct value. So it's going to the array and it's getting the value, and then it's going to the next element and getting the next value. So X will equal the values that are in the array, and it will just go through all of the values, and once it gets to the end, the loop will stop. So it's just a simpler way of doing it if you don't need the I variable for some other reason, because sometimes you might need the actual element index so that you can do a calculation or something like that. So which loop you choose will depend on the situation. Right, now that we've covered loops and arrays and variables, let's go back up and have a look at what we can do to solve this problem. So basically what I think he wants is, when we press this button, to bypass, well, it's array 3, isn't it? So bypass sine wave 3 and sine wave 4, and to toggle those panels on and off. So what we're going to do, we're going to rewrite this. So we're getting all 4 sine wave generators into variables, but we're actually only working with 2 sine wave generators in the loop. So we only need 2 sine wave generators, references to 2 sine wave generators. So we'll make a const, we'll call it sine gens, and this is going to be an array. And we're going to add 2 of our sine wave generators, the 2 he's interested in, which is sine wave 3 and sine wave 4. Into this array. So where he's getting the references and putting them into individual variables, we're just going to stick them straight into the array. So we can copy this, and there's 2 ways to do this. We can do sine gens, and the element we want to put it into, and then equals the sine wave generator. So just like you would with a variable. Or if you don't necessarily know the index you want to put it in, and you just want to stick it at the end of the array, so you just want to insert it into the array, you can use the push function. And if we look in the API browser, the push function is there, and it says it adds the given element at the end of the array, and it actually returns the size of the array as well. So we can just delete that and do sine gens dot push, and then we put our call to get the sine wave generator in there. So that will take sine wave generator 3, or a reference to sine wave generator 3, and it will add it at the end of our array. And since this array is currently empty, we know that this is going to be added at index 0. And then we'll do the same thing for sine wave generator 4. So that's done. So I'll hit F5. Oh, I won't hit F5 yet because we'll get an error. Comment those 2 lines out. Okay, hit F5. So our sine wave generators are stored in this array called sine gens. We're going to do the same thing for the panel. I'll show you a shortcut actually, because one thing you could do, I'll write it out longhand and then I'll show you the shortcut. So we could do const panels, and we could do the same thing. We could use the panels.push and then get the reference from here. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is just to put it directly into the array. So before, when we were storing numbers, we were just writing them straight into the declaration like this. Well, you can do the same thing when you're getting components or modules and stuff like that. So you could just write content.getComponent panel1, content.getComponent panel2. So that's another way to do it, and that will insert those panels into the array. Another way to do it, let's delete this, is you select your panels over here, you right click and select create script variable definition, and see it asks for a name for the array it's going to create, so we'll call it panels. We'll hit OK, and now that's copied to the clipboard, so now we can just press Ctrl V to paste that in, and you see it does the same thing. It's just done it on 2 lines, that's all. But that does exactly the same thing. So that's how you can add components to an array. But whether you use the push method or you do it like this, where you put them inside the declaration, or you add them in with the specified index, it doesn't matter as long as they're inside the array. Okay, so now we've got 2 arrays, and each array has 2 elements. And we want our button to affect both the panels and the sine generators. So we could, let's go to our loop here. We could, instead of having 0 to 2, we could put here sine gens.length, or we could put panels.length, because they're both going to be equal to 2. So it doesn't matter as long as you know what you're dealing with. Another way you could do it, if these had different amounts, for example, if we had 3 sine wave generators, we'd need to use 2 loops. In fact, let's do that. I know that this isn't exactly the problem that's been set for us, but I'll show you that way as well. So we'll add 3 sine wave generators into this array. So this array has 3 elements. This array has 2 elements. And what we'll do, I'm going to comment all of this out just so we can have that remaining there, but we're going to write new code. Okay, so we're going to write for I equals 0. I is less than sine gens dot length I plus. Now what he wants to do with the sine generators is bypass them. I think I said actually he wants to bypass the panels as well, but that isn't possible. So it's just the sine generators he wants to bypass. And usually we'd put curly braces after a for loop. You only need to do that if you're going to put more than one line, more than one command inside the for loop. We're only going to put one command in, so we actually don't need to have the curly braces. But if you're unsure about that, just use the curly braces. You can't go wrong with the curly braces, but you can go wrong without them. Okay, and then we're going to put sine gens I dot set bypassed 1 minus value. So inverted the value of the button which is coming in here. So I'll hit F5. And now if we go to the front interface, we'll see if this button, this button is now affecting sine wave generators 2, 3, and 4, which are the sine wave generators we stored in our array. And then for the panels, we'll do a separate loop, and we can use I again here because this loop is after the first loop, so it's not inside of it, it's not nested, so we won't have any conflict. So we can use the same variable name. So we'll do I is equals 0, I is less than panels.length, I plus. And this time it's going to be panels I dot show control value. So now the panels are going off and on as the bypass buttons are changed. Now with both of these situations, we can actually swap them for a for in loop. Because we're not using I to do any calculations, we don't need to actually use I. So I'm going to rewrite this. Let's put some curly braces around the sine wave gen 1. Get rid of this bit for now, we don't need that. Let's get rid of all this earlier stuff, don't need that. What we could do, imagine this, we're in our for loop, we're doing for I equals 0, blah, blah, blah. And inside our loop, we create a function called, we create a variable called x, and x equals sine gens I. So x is going to be equal to sine gen 2 on the first time through the loop, then it'll be sine gen 3, then it'll be sine gen 4. So it's doing exactly the same as we've got here, sine gens I, sine gens I. So instead of putting sine gens I here, we could just put x. And this is what we can also do with a for in loop. So instead of having to write this extra line where we're declaring a variable called x, we can actually do it in the loop declaration. So I'll delete this. So we'll do for x in sine gens. Get rid of the extra curly braces, we don't need those. Hit F5 and we have exactly the same behavior. And using an in loop like this is generally more efficient than using a for I loop, but obviously it'll depend on the situation. Here we don't need the I variable, we don't need the array index, so it works out quite well to use the for in loop, and I recommend use a for in loop whenever you can. We can do the same thing for the panels here as well. So we'll call this, we could call it x because we're outside of this loop, so we could use the same variable name, but we'll call it p just to be different. It's also a convention, if you're not calling it x, to use the first letter of the array that you're iterating. And that will be like that, and that should work. So in this case, P refers to each individual panel when we go through the loop. And for X, we're referring to the sine wave generator references. If we go back to the original task, which only had 2 sine wave generators, so we'll take one out. So we've got 2 sine wave generators in this array and 2 panels in this array. What we can do is we can just use a single loop because we've got the same number of things in both arrays. If I was doing this, I would probably still go with 2 separate loops because it's clearer what's happening. You can see that this refers to sine wave generators and this refers to panels, so it is clearer, but I will show you anyway how you can do it with a single loop. So for the single loop method, we are going to have to use a for I loop because we're not referring to just panels and we're not referring to just sine gens. We are referring to both of them, so we need to have an iterator. Do I is less than, again we could do 2, or we could do sine gens.length or panels.length, it doesn't really matter. We'll go with sine gens.length. We're going to need curly braces here, and then it's the same as we had before, sine gens I dot set bypassed 1 minus value panels I dot show control value, and the behavior should be the same. Yeah, we can just see those two bypassing there. So this is a way to use a single loop to control both aspects. Like I say, I'd use 2 loops because it's clearer to see what's happening, and because the panels and the sine generators aren't really related. If this was sine generators and samplers, then maybe it'd make a bit more sense because they're both sound generators, but that's up to you, and it's kind of a sort of personal preference. But I like the thing that makes it easier to read, and I think the 2 separate loops is clearer and easier. So let's go back to that. All right, I hope you found this useful. I hope it's sort of encouraged you to experiment with these things and use arrays in place of variables, because a lot of the time that's the best way to go. And it's certainly going to help to make your code more efficient. And if you find yourself writing the same sort of things over and over and over again, and declaring variables that are very similar to each other, it might be better to use an array. Alright, thank you very much for watching. Any questions or comments, leave them below the video on YouTube or on Patreon. Please hit the like button and subscribe button, and I'll see you next time.